Hello, my name is Nicky Mouha and I'm a contractor at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Welcome to ITC 2021. I'm here to give a talk entitled T5, hashing 5 inputs with 3 compression calls. And this is joint work with Yevgeniy Dodis, Dmitry Khovratovich, and Mridul Nandi. First, let's start by recalling the general Merkle Tree that is a well-known construction and part of the cryptographic building block of blockchain, which is used in cryptocurrencies and then smart contracts. How does a Merkle Tree work? Let's assume that we are looking at hash functions or compression functions with 2 inputs and 1 output. In that case, if we have 8 message blocks to process, then we can do this using a tree construction using 7 compression function calls to obtain at the root node the hash value. Now, an interesting property about Merkle trees is that if we want to prove set membership, so let's say that we want to show that element M5 is part of the Merkle tree, given a certain root that has been computed of the tree, then to prove this, we don't need to recompute the entire tree. It is sufficient to only have 1 element at every level of the tree as part of the proof. Because as you can see from the picture here, having M5 and then also 1 element on every level, M6, Y, and Z, it's possible to recompute the hash value that we find at the root. So that makes it actually really efficient to use Merkle trees for proofs of set membership because the tree can be really large. However, the size of the proof is proportional only to the depth of the tree or to the base 2 logarithm of the number of elements of the tree. Now there's a related construction called the Merkle-Damgård construction that works similarly. However, where the Merkle tree was a parallel tree construction, here we have a sequential construction. The Merkle-Damgård construction might be familiar to many of you guys as well, because the Merkle-Damgård construction is used in the most well-known hash functions such as MD5, SHA-1, and SHA-2. And it is a construction where we again need 7 compression function calls to process 8 message blocks. Now, the way that this is typically done is that at the beginning, we want to mark the beginning of the evaluation of the hash function and say that, let's say M1 is the place where the IV is contained. And then at the end, we want to include the length of the message, which is something known as Merkle-Damgård strengthening. Now, for the examples that we're looking at here, we've assumed that there's a general setup of Merkle trees and Merkle-Damgård where the compression functions do not need to be equal. However, when a Merkle tree is instantiated, you will typically only use 1 hash function to, only 1 compression function to evaluate this input. So we're looking at a more general type of construction here. And what we are interested in is if it's possible to improve over Merkle trees and over Merkle-Damgård. And for a really long amount of time, people have thought that that was not possible. We are now for the first time showing that it is possible to maintain more or less the same level of collision security, but to process more messages. Let me for this first present the concrete construction for the smallest case. Let's say that we have 5 message blocks that we want to process. Then using the standard Merkle tree, you would need 1 fewer. So you would need 4 compression function calls. However, we're showing that it is possible to also do this with just 3 compression function calls. So the construction looks a bit similar to the Merkle tree, but there is now a 5th message block that we are XORing in at the output of each of the compression functions and also right at the very end. Okay, so a question, of course, is, well, does this construction work? What would the security be? For these styles of constructions, there's actually a general result that shows possibilities, impossibilities, and collision security, preimage security of these constructions. And that is some result that is known as Stam's bound and proven in a paper by Rogoway and Steinberger. Then the example that I'm showing here on this slide, I'm assuming that there are 3 compression function calls. Actually, in the paper by Rogoway and Steinberger, it's assumed that those functions are not compressing, but are random permutations. However, the result straightforwardly applies to constructions where you have compressing primitives as well. It's a result that does not put a limit on the number of permutations or compression functions that you have in your construction, but here I'm using as an example 3. That's also the example that you had on the previous slide. Then for those functions, we are assuming that the inputs and outputs can be processed using arbitrary functions. So when you see here F1, F2, F3, the inputs of the cryptographic permutations, and then G at the output, it's assumed that they are arbitrary functions. And then Stam's bound will give a result that is showing a generic attack on any construction with a certain number of compression function calls and with a certain size of inputs and outputs. Here I'm providing this generic result. So as you can see, it involves a parameter k. K is the number of random functions or the number of random permutations. And in this case, then k is 3. For the input, this variable m that we have, if I go back to the previous slide, m needs to be, well, how much wider your input is than the size of your compression function. So I have these 2-to-1 compression functions, but we are processing 5 inputs. So then m is 2.5 times the size of a compression function. We also need another parameter, and that is s. So s in this case will be 0.5 because it relates to the size of the input. So the size of the final output of the whole hash function that we're providing is half of the size of the input. Okay, so let's plug in these numbers. And we find that Rogoway and Steinberger in their paper show that there's a generic collision attack. So collision meaning that you're looking for 2 distinct messages that provide the same output, that has a complexity of 2 to the power 0.25 n. So that would be 2 to the power n over 4. However, let's recall that we are looking here at an output of 0.5 n bits using the formula as Rogoway and Steinberger provided them. So actually, this means that the collision security can be optimal for such a construction. At least there's no generic attack given by Rogoway and Steinberger, because generic attack on any construction providing 0.5 n-bit output would be using 2 to the power 0.25 n queries. Okay, so Rogoway and Steinberger are not ruling out that there might be a construction using these parameters that would provide optimal collision security. For preimage security, we will not reach an optimal value because Rogoway and Steinberger are showing that using 2 to the power 0.33 n, so n over 3, it's always possible to find a collision attack. However, a preimage attack, sorry. However, if we're looking for a certain security level, so you want to say, I don't want any attacks beyond a certain number of queries, then it's sufficient to consider collision attacks here because the preimage attacks will have a higher complexity. Now, of course, this is a result that we will need to prove for the construction that we're providing here for T5. And that is something that we do in the paper. So as we show, the collision security is actually not just a result that we know cannot be better than 2 to the power n over 2 because of the birthday attack and also because of the attack that was shown in the previous slide. But it's something that we reach, showing that the bound that we are constructing here for the security is tight, by showing that collision security is indeed 2 2 to the power n over 2, assuming here that we have n-bit outputs, and preimage attack also tied of 2 to the power 2n over 2, again assuming n-bit outputs here on this slide. Okay, so this is showing that T5 is an improvement over the Merkle tree in the sense that it is possible to process one more block of message with the same number of compression function calls without losing in security, losing in collision security, up to, as you can see here, a small logarithmic factor. And let's see what we can do with this T5 construction, using it, for example, in Merkle tree. Well, before we can explain how this would work, we're going to introduce two notions here. One notion is a notion of full opening. So a full opening means that you're providing all of the messages that are part of the tree and using this to hash. And the local opening, as I explained on the beginning of the presentation, is that you are not providing all of these inputs, but only one input on every level. Now, the reason why this notion is going to become interesting is because when you're looking at a full opening, you can guarantee that your hash corresponds to a valid message. But for a local opening, that's not necessarily the case. The hash at the end might not be corresponding to a valid entire tree. Okay, so this is one thing that we want to introduce, this notion of full opening versus local opening. Another thing we want to introduce related to this is how it leads to different types of collision resistance. So the traditional notion of collision resistance or full collision resistance would be that you're saying, give me two distinct messages that have the same hash value. Now, local collision resistance is collision resistance where we are looking for two distinct local openings with the same hash. There's a third notion that will then also become possible, which is full local collision resistance. We introduced this notion to show, well, I want to find a collision between a full tree and a local opening. And this is actually in practice a common setting, but not universal, where you have an honestly computed hash value and an untrusted opening, and you're interested in seeing what the collision resistance is between such honestly computed hash and this local opening, untrusted opening that is provided. Okay. Another notion that we want to introduce here is a conservative opening and an aggressive opening. So for a conservative opening of T5, so this will be an opening of message M1 here, message block M1. You're providing all of the siblings, so M2, M3, M4, and M5. For an aggressive opening, you're providing one input less. So instead of providing M2, M3, M4, and M5, we're providing M2, M5, and then this Y value, which is the input of H3. Okay, so I'll explain why these notions will become useful. Here we are constructing a Merkle tree based on T5. And I'll explain why this tree is faster and shallower than the standard Merkle tree. So the overall construction is a Merkle tree construction, but we have 5-to-1 compression function calls. And these 5-to-1 compression function calls are instantiated using our T5 construction that we propose in this paper. For this construction, what we show is what the full local collision resistance is and what the local collision resistance is, by proving that we reach a full local collision resistance of 2 to the power n over 3 and a local collision resistance of 2 to the power n over 4. So as you can see, this would be less than what we had for the Merkle trees, where it was 2 to the power n over 2. But what we're going to evaluate now is using slightly different assumptions if we might go back to this 2 to the power n over 2 security. The way we do this is we give a conjectured security result. And the conjecture is related to the K XOR problem. So the K XOR problem is a problem where if we're given certain oracles, F1, F2, and so on to Fk, that are outputting n-bit strings, then we are interested in finding x1, x2, and so on to xk, for which F1, x1, XOR F2, x2, XOR, and so on, Fk, xk, is going to be equal to 0. So this is the well-studied generalized birthday problem. Information theoretically, the 3 XOR problem is only secure up to the cube root, so 2 to the power n over 3 queries. However, there's no better algorithm known than a square root algorithm, which would be the standard birthday problem. So if we are assuming that the 3 XOR problem is hard, then we can use this to then overall also show that for full local collision resistance of a Merkle tree using T5, that we are reaching security of 2 to the power n over 2 instead of n over 3. However, it's a conjecture result. And for local collision resistance using Merkle tree with T5, we're assuming 4 XOR hardness. So the 4 XOR problem would admit information theoretically a result of 2 to the power n over 4. However, the best known algorithm introduced by David Wagner when he was studying this problem is one that is cube root, so 2 to the power n over 3. Now, given these results, here I give an overview of the parameters of the security of not just the standard Merkle tree, but also Merkle tree when it's instantiated with T5, assuming that we are doing conservative openings, so opening all of the siblings, or aggressive openings where we're opening one block less. And then in the case of one block less, as I explained, there is a conjectured security result of 2 to the power n over 2 for this common but not universal setting where we're interested in full local collision resistant security. Okay, so here I show this graphically. We see for the comparison of Merkle with these Merkle plus T5 variants that we save quite a lot in the number of build calls, because instead of having 5 message blocks that we need 4 compression functions to compress, we can now process 5 using 3 compression functions. But differently, it's possible using 3 compression functions to process not 4 but 5 inputs, so a gain of 25%. So that's the improvement of 25% in the number of build calls. In terms of the number of calls to update, we save as well, but a little bit less. So we want to do an operation to update the tree, to insert an element, to replace an element, to remove an element. Then we also need to recompute the root hash. So this involves an effort on every level. So all of these operations are proportional to the depth of the tree. That's where we're saving 14%. However, if we're looking at the cost of verifying in terms of number of calls a proof, or the terms of the length of a proof, the size of an opening, then what we see is that they are a bit longer. So if that is the bottleneck, this might not be the most interesting construction. This is more interesting where the bottleneck would be to build the tree or to update the tree. However, we show that the increase is not necessarily so much, depending, of course, on the assumptions that you make. We actually can decrease, compared to the Merkle tree, the number of calls to verify the proof of the opening by 14%. However, the size of the opening will be slightly larger, and we show for the aggressive variant with conjectured security of n over 2 that we have 29% longer proofs. We also looked into the Merkle-Damgård variant that I explained at the beginning, which is this sequential construction. It's interesting to consider plugging in T5 here as well. Now what happens for the Merkle-Damgård variant is that you obtain a construction where if the chaining value is going to be this 5th message block, then you can see that there's quite a lot of parallelism that becomes possible. Now it's possible to process M1 and M2, but also M3 and M4 independently of each other. And then one step ahead, if we're looking at the next call of T5, it's possible to process H3 on the previous block and M1 and M2 of the new block, because they do not depend on the chaining value that we've produced in the previous step. So this is also showing how T5 can give an improvement over the standard Merkle-Damgård construction. Okay, here I'd like to conclude my talk. So the main idea of T5, a new construction that we introduced in this paper, is that it's an improvement over the Merkle tree in the sense that we can process not 4, but 5 inputs using 3 compression calls, while still keeping collision security to 2 to the power n over 2, or in this case plus this logarithmic factor. And then we use this to instantiate the Merkle tree and variants of Merkle-Damgård using T5. For Merkle plus T5, we are conjecturing, based on a conjecture related to the 3 XOR problem, full local collision security of n over 2. For this construction, the number of calls and the verification time is reduced by respectively 25% and 14%. However, the length of the proof is increased by 29%. Then we also recall the Merkle-Damgård construction, and we show that when you plug in T5 there, there's a lot more possibility for parallelism to evaluate this construction. So by this, I conclude my talk. I'd be happy to, of course, it's a virtual talk, to answer any questions that you guys might have over for us, either by email. If you're watching this video pre-recorded online, you can find our email addresses in the paper, or during the ITC conference, where I'll give a short version of this talk, and there's a few minutes to ask questions afterwards. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much for your attention.